This is my true story. I spent my life working hard, wearing the same old clothes so my daughter could live with comfort and pride. I thought she would see my sacrifice and honor me in my old age. But instead, she mocked me. In front of family, she laughed at my patched shirts and called me an embarrassment. That night, I decided her cruelty would not go unanswered. I erased everything she thought was hers, her credit, her comfort, her name. You won't believe how I did. But before I tell you, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people like me. From the day my daughter was born, I stopped living for myself and lived only for her. I grew up poor, and I promised myself that my child would never feel the shame I felt wearing hand-me-downs and walking to school with holes in my shoes. When she was little, I wore the same old shirts and jackets, patched again and again, while she wore new dresses every season. People told me to buy something better for myself, but I refused because every coin I saved went into her future. I worked long hours at a factory, sometimes picking up shifts at night, and when that wasn't enough, I did small repair jobs on weekends. I often came home with sore muscles, blistered hands, and a tired back, but I pushed through because the thought of her smiling made the pain worth it. When she wanted school trips, I paid for them. When she needed a computer for her studies, I bought it, even though it cost me months of wages. She never saw how many nights I went to bed with only bread and tea so that she could eat well. I told myself that my comfort didn't matter if she was taken care of. When she grew older, her taste for clothes became expensive. She wanted branded shoes, designer jackets, dresses like her friends had. I never told her no. I worked harder, borrowed when I had to, and made sure she always walked with pride. I told myself it was better that people admired her than pitied her. At her graduation, when she wore a gown and took pictures with her friends, I stood at the back of the crowd, wearing the same old jacket I had owned for years. I didn't care how I looked, because seeing her succeed felt like the reward for every sacrifice I made. Later, when it came time for her wedding, I poured everything I had left into making it perfect. I paid for the venue, the food, the decorations, even part of her honeymoon. I wore the same suit I had worn to weddings years before, cleaned and pressed, but still old, while she walked in a shining white dress. No one looked at me, but everyone looked at her, and that was enough for me. After her wedding, when she and her husband needed help buying their home, I stepped in again. I co-signed loans, opened joint accounts, gave her access to my savings, because I believed she would always honor my trust. I thought she would remember that her comfort came from my sacrifice. I thought she would see the man in the old jacket and know that behind those worn clothes was the reason she had new ones. For me, her success was my greatest achievement. Her comfort was my pride. Her happiness was my purpose. I never asked her to repay me. All I wanted was respect. All I wanted was for her to look at me with the same love I had carried for her since the day I first held her in my arms. The disrespect from my daughter did not explode all at once. It began quietly, in small comments that I tried to ignore, but each one left a scar on my heart. At first, it was her tone whenever she spoke about my clothes. She would glance at my old shoes and ask why I still wore them, as if she didn't know that those same shoes had carried me to long shifts that paid for her education. She would wrinkle her nose at my patched shirts, even though those patches were the reason she had new dresses. She mocked the jackets I bought from thrift stores, forgetting that when she was little, I worked overtime to buy her the latest brands so she would never feel embarrassed at school. She would laugh with her friends on the phone about how old-fashioned I looked, not caring that I could hear every word. I stayed silent, telling myself it was just careless talk, not real cruelty. But the cracks widened. She began avoiding walking next to me in public. If I wore my simple jackets to her social gatherings, she would whisper that I should stay in the background. Once, she even told me not to take pictures with her because my clothes didn't look good for social media. I swallowed the pain, stood aside, and let her smile for the cameras while I faded into the background. My silence was not weakness. I thought it was love. I believed that patience was the right choice, that she would realize one day how much I had given her. But instead, my patience became her permission. She grew bolder. She criticized everything I wore, everything I did, as if appearances mattered more than character, more than sacrifice, more than blood. When I sat at the dinner table wearing my old sweater, she looked at me with disgust, saying, "Why don't you ever buy something new? You embarrass me." I wanted to remind her that the reason she had all her new clothes was because I chose not to buy anything for myself. But the words stuck in my throat. I sat in silence, staring at my plate, pretending not to hear. That was my mistake, because each time I stayed silent, she thought it was acceptable. Each time I let it pass, she grew colder. The daughter I once held in my arms with pride now looked at me like I was a shame she had to carry. She forgot the nights I went without dinner. She forgot the winters I walked in thin coats so she could have warm ones. She forgot the father who gave up every comfort so she could shine. And when she forgot, she replaced gratitude with mockery. The first cracks had appeared, and I told myself they would heal. But instead, those cracks spread deeper, until the day came when she broke me completely in front of everyone. The day that broke me came at a family gathering. Relatives, cousins, and neighbors had come together for a celebration. The house was filled with laughter, food on the table, children running around, and adults chatting in groups. I sat quietly in my corner, wearing the same jacket I had worn for years. It was clean, pressed, and patched in places, but still the only one I owned. I was content just being there, watching everyone enjoy themselves. For me, gatherings were about family, not appearance. But for my daughter, appearances meant everything. As the evening went on, she began introducing her husband and children to relatives, smiling and speaking proudly. At first, she ignored me, as if I was invisible. But then, one relative looked at me, smiled kindly, and said to her, "You are lucky to still have your father with you." Instead of agreeing with gratitude, she laughed. Not a laugh of pride, but a cruel laugh. She turned to the group and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Lucky? He's an embarrassment. Look at his old clothes. People must pity me when they see him." The words struck me like a knife. For a moment, the room grew silent. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some looking at the floor, some pretending not to hear. I sat frozen, my eyes lowering to the ground. I felt my cheeks burn with shame, not because of my clothes, but because my daughter, the same child I had given my life for, mocked me in front of everyone. Poverty had never broken me. Hard work had never broken me. Hunger and struggle had never broken me. But her words, her laugh, her humiliation in that moment broke me completely. I wanted to vanish. I wanted the ground to swallow me. I stared at my hands on my lap, the same hands that once worked until the skin peeled, the same hands that carried her to school, tied her shoelaces, gave her food. And now those hands trembled with humiliation while people pretended not to notice my pain. She kept laughing, turning her head, adding more. "He refuses to buy new clothes. He looks like he belongs on the street. I don't know how people don't judge me for this." Her cruelty was not hidden. It was public, intentional, and sharp. I forced myself not to cry in front of them. I stayed silent, but inside, something shattered. I had never felt so small in my entire life. I excused myself from the table, walking away slowly, my head bowed, while whispers filled the room behind me. That night, alone in my room, I replayed her words again and again. "You're an embarrassment. People pity me." Those words burned into my mind. I thought of every meal I skipped, every shirt I refused to buy, every hour I worked late, all so she could wear new clothes and stand tall. And this was my reward, to be mocked, humiliated, and laughed at by the one person I had sacrificed everything for. That was the cruelest moment of my life. Not because of the jacket I wore, but because of the daughter who wore my sacrifice like it was nothing. That night after the gathering, I sat alone in my room, the lights off, staring into the darkness. Her words replayed in my mind like a broken record. "You're an embarrassment. people pity me. I whispered them to myself, each time cutting deeper. I had been called many things in my life by strangers, poor, uneducated, simple, but never had I felt pain like hearing my own daughter say those words. My clothes were old, yes. My shoes were patched, yes. But they told the story of my life, of my sacrifices, of my endless struggle to give her everything she wanted. And now those same symbols of sacrifice were turned into weapons against me by the very person I had protected all my life. I sat on the bed and remembered the years I worked double shifts, eating the same stale bread day after day so I could buy her a new dress for her school program. I remembered standing in long lines at thrift stores, not for myself, but so she could have shoes that would last while I made do with ones falling apart. I remembered the winters where I shivered in thin jackets while she walked to school in a coat I bought with money I didn't have. And I thought about how, as a child, she once held my hand tightly in gratitude when I gave her new clothes. Now, that same daughter mocked me for the clothes on my back. My heart broke in that room. I had believed that sacrifice created respect, that love created loyalty, that blood created bonds that could not be broken. But I was wrong. All my years of giving had only taught her to take more. All my silence had only taught her to laugh louder. I realized that night that she no longer saw me as her father. She saw me as a weakness, as a shame she had to carry. My sorrow ran so deep I could barely breathe. Tears ran down my face, and I let them fall without wiping them away. For hours, I sat there with nothing but the sound of my own grief filling the room. But as the night stretched on, my sorrow slowly changed. It hardened. The grief began to turn into something else, something colder, steadier, sharper. I thought about how she lived her life now. The clothes, the car, the house, the comfort. All of it tied to the foundation I had built. Every luxury she enjoyed came from the sacrifices I made, the loans I co-signed, the accounts I controlled. And yet she dared to mock me. That realization sparked a new resolve. If she believed my old clothes made me an embarrassment, then I would show her what true embarrassment was, living without the comfort she thought was hers forever. I would take back the power she never respected. That night, my tears dried, and in their place came clarity. I decided her laughter at my expense would be the last laugh she ever had. As I sat in silence, one truth became clearer than anything else. My daughter had built her entire life on foundations she did not own. The house she lived in, the cars she drove, the credit she used to buy her endless clothes and luxury items, none of it was truly hers. All of it had my name written underneath. When she was younger and wanted her first credit card, she was too young to qualify, so I co-signed. When she and her husband wanted their mortgage, the bank only agreed because my name was strong enough to back the loan. Every account she accessed was connected to me. She never earned the trust of banks or institutions on her own. She borrowed mine. I gave her access to family savings, joint accounts, and even investment funds, not because she contributed, but because I wanted her to feel secure. I thought it was a father's duty to provide stability for his child, but she took that stability and twisted it into arrogance. She strutted around in her designer shoes and jackets, laughing at my old patched clothes, never realizing that without me, those cards in her purse would be nothing but plastic. Her credit was my credit. Her comfort was my sacrifice. Her lifestyle was my foundation. She mocked me because she believed I was beneath her, when in truth, she was standing on my shoulders the entire time. The forgotten truth was simple. With one decision, one signature, I could erase everything she believed was hers. Without my name, her loans would collapse. Without my signature, her credit would vanish. Without my support, her comfort would dissolve overnight. She had grown arrogant because I had stayed silent. She had grown cruel because I had been patient. She had grown blind because I allowed her to live in an illusion. But illusions are fragile, and now it was time to break hers. I realized that every insult she threw at me was built on the false belief that she had risen above me. But she never rose above me. She rose because I lifted her. And now that she laughed at the man who carried her, I would put her back on the ground where she truly belonged. That truth gave me strength. I no longer felt weak in my patched shirts. I no longer felt ashamed in my old shoes. Because I knew that my worn clothes were honest, and her shining ones were borrowed. Borrowed from me. She forgot the truth. But I never did. And soon, she was going to remember it the hardest way possible. The morning after the family gathering, when the humiliation was still fresh in my mind, I woke up with a different kind of strength. I had spent the night reflecting on everything I had endured, and I knew I could not allow it to continue. My daughter thought she had won when she mocked me, but what she did not realize was that her words lit a fire inside me. For years, I had been patient, hoping she would change, but she had crossed a line that could never be repaired. So I began to form a plan, not with anger that burned out quickly, but with cold, steady calculation. My plan would not be about shouting or fighting. It would not be about arguing with her in front of others. Words meant nothing anymore. She had laughed at my dignity, so I would erase her comfort. She had mocked my old clothes, so I would take away her luxuries. She had called me an embarrassment, so I would turn her into the one who had nothing left to show. That was my decision, and it was final. I began with a phone call to my lawyer, a man who had known me for many years and handled my affairs with honesty. When he answered, I told him I needed a private meeting. My voice was calm, but my heart was steady with resolve. He agreed to see me that very day. I gathered all my documents, account details, deeds, credit files, investment papers, and placed them in a folder. As I held that folder in my hands, I realized that this was the true source of power, not the clothes on my back, not the appearances at gatherings, but the paperwork that tied my daughter's life to mine. She thought she controlled everything, but on those papers, my name was above hers. That morning, as I walked out of the house, she didn't even notice me leave. She sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone, planning her next shopping trip. She had no idea that I was on my way to cut her future out from under her feet. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, I explained everything. I told him I wanted my daughter's name removed from every account and every credit line she had tied to me. I wanted her erased from estate documents, removed from co-signed loans, and blocked from accessing any part of my savings or investments. The lawyer listened carefully, then nodded. "It can be done," he said, "but you must be sure." I looked him straight in the eye and said, "I am sure." She mocked me as if I was nothing. "It is time she learns I am the reason she has everything." He nodded again and began preparing the documents. Page after page, I signed with steady hands. Each signature felt like a nail sealing the coffin of her arrogance. The lawyer assured me it was all legal and final. By the time we finished, my daughter's financial ties to me were gone. But I was not done. My next stop was my financial advisor. He had helped me manage investments over the years, and he too greeted me with respect. I told him what I had done with the lawyer and asked him to restructure my assets. I wanted all funds pulled into accounts under my name only. I wanted her cards canceled, her access revoked, and her credit frozen. He looked surprised, but he followed my instructions. He contacted the banks, filed the necessary forms, and within hours, my daughter's cards were useless. She would try to swipe them and find nothing. Her credit lines would collapse. Her comfort would vanish. The numbers were tallied. Millions in assets, savings, and investments redirected entirely under my authority. My daughter's name was wiped away from everything she believed she owned. I also gave instructions to redirect part of the wealth into charitable trusts and to distant relatives who had never disrespected me. I wanted my sacrifice to still mean something, but not for the one who spit on it. That way, the money would bring dignity to others, not fuel her arrogance. After everything was signed and processed, I sat in the advisor's office, holding the confirmation papers. I felt no guilt. I felt no hesitation. My daughter had laughed at me in public, thinking I was powerless, but I had just proven to myself that I was far from powerless. I was the foundation of her life, and I had just pulled that foundation away. On my way home, I walked through the streets slowly, thinking about what I had done. People passed by without knowing the storm I had unleashed, but inside I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I was not the embarrassed father in patched clothes. I was the man who had taken back control of his dignity. When I reached the house, my daughter looked at me, annoyed that I was wearing the same old jacket. She rolled her eyes, muttered something about embarrassment again, and went back to her phone. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because I knew that soon her arrogance would collapse, on its own. Soon, she would try to use her card and find it declined. Soon, she would call the bank and be told she had no rights. Soon, she would realize that the father she mocked was the only reason she had anything. My plan was complete, but I kept my silence. Silence was more powerful than words. She had no idea that her downfall was already written in ink. I went to bed that night with a calm heart. I had not shouted. I had not begged. I had not argued. I had acted. And by acting, I had erased her comfort forever. That was my plan. Simple, legal, final. To take away what she never respected and remind her, too late, that respect cannot be bought. The plan was ready, but a plan means nothing without action. The very next morning, I began the execution. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping plain tea in my old shirt, while my daughter scrolled on her phone, laughing with her friends. She bragged about shopping, about new clothes she wanted, about trips she planned to take. She had no idea that all of it was already gone. I left the house calmly and went straight to the bank. The manager greeted me with respect because he had known me for years. I handed him the documents my lawyer and financial advisor had prepared, and I gave clear instructions. Cancel every card with her name attached, freeze every line of credit connected to me, remove her access from every account she thought she owned. The manager asked again if I was sure. I nodded without hesitation. She mocked me for my clothes. Now she will have nothing to wear. He processed the forms one by one. I signed with a steady hand. Within hours, her credit was erased. The cards she loved to swipe were useless pieces of plastic. The loans she thought she controlled were frozen. The accounts she flaunted at her friends were locked. She was financially erased, not by fraud or trickery, but by the law itself, by the authority she forgot I still had. From there, I withdrew a portion of the savings in cash, large enough to make sure she could never trace it, and secured it in my own name. I left the bank with confirmation slips tucked neatly in my folder. On the way home, I stopped at my lawyer's office again. He prepared letters showing the legal transfer of assets, so there would be no way for her to fight it later. It was done. Everything was clean, legal, irreversible. I did not stop there. I met my advisor once again and instructed him to redirect parts of my estate to charitable trusts and relatives who had shown me kindness. I wanted to ensure that my years of sacrifice would still help others, just not the one who humiliated me. By the afternoon, the execution was complete. My daughter was financially cut off from every corner. Her name was erased from credit reports. Her access was gone. Her comfort had been ripped out from under her. I walked back into the house quietly, carrying my folder of proof. She barely looked up from her phone. She was smiling, telling her friend about a shopping trip planned for the weekend. She thought she was secure, but her security was an illusion. I watched her laugh and thought to myself, tomorrow, the laughter will stop. That evening, I sat in my room in silence, my documents beside me, my heart calm. For years, she had mocked me, calling me outdated, embarrassing, worthless. But in reality, she was the one who was nothing without me, and now she would learn it in the most painful way. She would wake up in a world without the credit she depended on, without the money she wasted, without the luxury she flaunted, and I would not have to raise my voice once. That was the beauty of my execution. It was not loud, it was not violent, it was silent, legal, permanent. I did not destroy her with anger. I destroyed her with signatures. She thought my old clothes made me powerless. She was about to discover that my pen was stronger than her arrogance. By the time I lay down to sleep, I knew the execution was finished. I had taken back my dignity. Tomorrow, her comfort would disappear. The next day was the beginning of her downfall. I sat in my chair quietly as my daughter prepared to go shopping with her friends. She dressed herself in expensive clothes, shoes bought with money she thought was endless, and she grabbed her purse with confidence. She kissed her children goodbye, ignored me as always, and walked out the door. I waited, knowing what was coming. Hours later, she returned, her face pale, her voice raised, her purse still full, but her pride empty. She stormed into the living room and shouted at her husband, "My card got declined!" He looked at her with confusion and told her to try again. She pulled out her phone and tried another card. Declined again. I could see the panic building in her eyes. She called the bank, her voice sharp, demanding answers. But the calm voice on the other end told her the truth. Her accounts were frozen, her credit erased, her access removed. She shouted louder, insisting there was a mistake, but the answer was the same every time. "You have no rights. You are not authorized." Her voice cracked as she begged, but there was no way back. When she hung up, she turned to me with fury. "Did you know about this?" she asked. I looked at her in silence. My silence was louder than any answer I could have given. She paced the room, pulling her hair, trying card after card, all useless. The reality hit her. She was cut off completely. Later that evening, creditors began calling. She answered in her usual arrogant tone at first, but soon her face changed. She owed more than she realized, and now she had no way to pay. Her husband grew tense, asking questions she could not answer. Their argument filled the house. The children cried, confused by the chaos. I sat in my corner, listening without speaking, watching the empire of arrogance crumble piece by piece. The next day, she tried to apply for a new loan, thinking she could fix it quickly. But her application was denied. Her credit was destroyed. No bank would touch her. She called relatives for help, but many turned away, tired of her prideful ways. Friends who once admired her for her lifestyle began to distance themselves. She had built her identity on wealth and appearances, and without them, she was nothing. Her humiliation grew, not in private, but in public. The same gatherings where she once mocked my clothes now became the stage where whispers about her downfall spread. Neighbors talked, relatives shook their heads, and she avoided going outside. Every time she looked at me, her eyes were filled with hatred and shame. She knew I had something to do with it, but she had no proof, no voice, no power. One evening, she confronted me again. She screamed, "You've ruined me!" I stood slowly, walked to the table, and handed her a single letter prepared by my lawyer. She tore it open with shaking hands. Inside were the documents showing the legal transfers, the closures, the frozen accounts. It was undeniable proof. Her face turned white as she read the words. Then she looked at me, trembling. "Why?" she asked. For the first time in years, I spoke with strength. "Because you called me an embarrassment. Now you have nothing." She collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down her face. Her husband walked away, disgusted. The children clung to each other silently. I turned and walked back to my room without another word. The fallout was complete. She had mocked me in front of others, laughed at my sacrifice, humiliated me for wearing old clothes. Now she was the one humiliated, stripped of every luxury, left with nothing but regret. And I was no longer the silent man in patched jackets. I was the father who had taken back everything. The fallout broke her pride, but I was not finished. I wanted her to remember for the rest of her life that humiliation has consequences. So I prepared the final blow, one that would leave no doubt in her mind that the father she mocked was the one who held her future in his hands. I met with my lawyer again and asked him to prepare a final letter, a simple one, but with words that would sting more than anything else. I gave him the exact line I wanted written. Once it was ready, I carried it home and placed it in an envelope. I kept it hidden until the right moment. That moment came one evening when she had finally calmed down after weeks of chaos. She sat in the living room, pale and tired, her phone silent, her friends gone, her comfort vanished. She looked at me with eyes full of hate and fear. That was when I placed the envelope on the table in front of her. She grabbed it quickly, tore it open, and pulled out the paper. On it were only a few words, written clearly and without decoration. You called me an embarrassment. Now you have nothing to show. She read it once, her face frozen. She read it again, her lips trembling. By the third time, her tears began to fall. She dropped the paper on the table and stared at me, speechless. Her husband stood behind her, reading it too, and he turned away in silence, no longer defending her, no longer standing by her pride. The children sat quietly, sensing the weight of the moment. I said nothing. I did not need to. The letter spoke louder than any speech I could have made. She tried to speak, to argue, to beg, but the words caught in her throat. She realized the truth at last. She had laughed at me, mocked my clothes, called me a shame. But without me, she was nothing. Her credit was gone, her wealth erased, her reputation destroyed. Everything she flaunted had collapsed. I left her with no comfort, no excuse, no path back. My silence was the weapon, and that paper was the blade. She picked it up again and again, as if reading it differently would change its meaning. But the meaning was clear. I had erased her arrogance the same way she tried to erase my dignity. I stood up slowly and walked back to my room, leaving her sitting there with her tears and her silence. I did not slam doors. I did not shout. I did not curse. I left her in the silence she had created. That was the final blow. Not just the loss of money, not just the fall of credit, but the knowledge that she had destroyed her own life by mocking the very man who built it. From that day on, every time she looked at her empty accounts, every time she saw her useless cards, every time she heard the whispers of others about her downfall, she would remember that line. You called me an embarrassment. Now you have nothing to show. And nothing would haunt her more than that truth. After everything was done, after the cards were declined, the accounts frozen, the credit erased, and the final message delivered, I felt a kind of peace I had not felt in years. For too long, I had lived with humiliation, silence, and shame brought upon me by my own daughter. I thought sacrifice would be enough. I thought love would be returned with respect. But when she mocked me in front of others, when she called me an embarrassment because of the clothes I wore, she showed me the truth. Respect cannot be bought, and gratitude cannot be forced. That night, as I sat alone in my old jacket, I no longer felt small or ashamed. Those clothes carried honesty. They carried the weight of sacrifice. They carried the story of every hour I worked and every meal I skipped to build her life. She laughed at them because she could not see their value, but I wore them now with pride. Because while she judged me for patches and old fabric, I had stripped her of everything shiny and false. My justice was not in shouting, not in raising my hand, not in lowering myself to her cruelty. My justice was in silence, in signatures, in the quiet erasure of everything she took for granted. I watched her crumble without lifting my voice once. I saw her friends disappear, her comfort vanish, her reputation collapse. She had mocked me for being old-fashioned, but now she had nothing modern left to hold on to. She had called me a burden, but now she was the one carrying debt and shame. I did not rejoice in her pain, but I felt balance return. I felt my dignity restored. I walked through the streets in my patched clothes without bowing my head. I met neighbors without feeling the sting of her words echoing in my ears. I no longer feared her laughter because she no longer had anything left to laugh with. I still lived simply, still drank plain tea, still wore the same jacket, but I did so with pride because now those things were mine honestly, not mocked falsely. I remembered her face when she read my final note, the way her tears mixed with silence, the way her pride broke into pieces. That was my victory. Not because she suffered, but because she finally saw the truth she had ignored her entire life. She thought respect came from clothes and appearances. But I showed her that respect comes from character, from sacrifice, from truth. And she had none of those left. I had given her everything once. Now I gave her nothing. That was my justice. She mocked my clothes, so I erased her comfort. She called me an embarrassment, so I erased her name. Respect cannot be bought, and she learned too late. I live my final years with peace, not surrounded by wealth, but by dignity. And that is worth more than all the riches I once handed her.